I think we should go ahead and get started. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We may still have some more people signing on as we continue, but we'll go ahead and proceed. My name is Steve Harding. I'm with Cloudingo, and the colleagues on the webinar are also with Cloudingo. Cloudingo is a Salesforce partner, and we're a data quality and data maintenance application that's on the App Exchange. We have Cloudingo is our sort of main platform application. We have a couple other applications on the App Exchange as well, DubeCatcher and Cloudingo Studio, in case you're not familiar with who we are. And today's webinar is part of an occasional webinar series that we are running about all things data. And today is specifically about tips and tricks for Salesforce data cleansing. So before we actually jump into the conversation with a panelist, I want to just take a minute and give a little bit of context around data quality and why that's important. So data, particularly today in the modern business world, is a key asset, and arguably it is the most important asset in any of our organizations. But I feel like we often take it for granted. It's sort of always there, and we look it up when we need it, kind of like a dictionary. It's always just sort of sitting there somewhere, and when you need it, you go to it and you look up a word. But if you think about the different other assets in an organization, other resources that you have, human resources, for example, if our colleagues are out for a day or on vacation, usually there's some overlap. There is some redundancy, so we can compensate for a person who's out. Or a physical resource, your laptop. If your laptop fails and crashes, we can fairly easily and in short order replace that laptop, and nothing shuts down as a result. Work continues. But if your data is out of hand, effectively your entire organization gets shut down. And we've seen this a few times, rare occasions, of course, but occasionally Salesforce has had some problems where an instance might go down for a period of time, and your entire organization is just sitting around twiddling their thumbs, waiting for that to come back up. So my reason for presenting the idea of the importance of data is to get you thinking about why we're doing this webinar series and why we built Cloudingo into the kind of organization that we built it into. And it's not just about having access to your data. As long as you have access, that's really, really important. But you also want to make sure that your data is as high a quality as you can be, because so much of your business relies on that data. Your reporting, your projecting, your activities at your sales and marketing and your support teams are all running based on that data. So quality is a really important aspect of your entire data set. And if there's one takeaway that I hope you get from this webinar, is that you understand that that is something important, that's important, and that you should be actively managing it, and that you should at least have some kind of plan for how you're going to manage your data and manage your data quality. So the flow of today's session. Ahead of time, we actually solicited questions from you, the people who are attending the webinar, and we got tons of responses. And what we did on our side was we sort of collated those responses into some super categories. So the first portion of this conversation is going to be focused on those major categories around data quality. And then the second half will be some specifics, more targeted questions that came in. During the intention of this webinar is not to be a demo. We're not demoing Cloudingo for you. Cloudingo is, of course, a data quality application. There are many other tools that you can use for data quality, and they're all great, excellent tools on the market. I encourage you to examine what's available to you and use what you can use. But we're not going to demo Cloudingo for you. We just want to talk about these issues and these concepts with the experts that I have on this panel, who are most familiar with how these things can impact your operational effectiveness. During the webinar, the chat is open. All of our attendees are muted, however. So if you have some additional questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. We have somebody online who's monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to get to those questions. If we don't have time within the context of this session to address those questions, we will follow up afterwards and make sure that your questions get answered. I also want to let you know the session is being recorded and will be sent out to all registered attendees after the session has been completed. All right. With that being said, I want to introduce our panelists. We have Beth Taricki and Jenny Boston. Beth and Jenny are data experts in terms of data management and data quality. These two individuals work directly with users and data stewards who are managing their Salesforce instances and are working to raise the level of the quality of that data. Beth is our senior sales engineer. She's the person on the top left. She works on the front end with our customers. So as people are sort of coming on board, as they're beginning to think about how to manage their data and how to improve the quality of that, she guides them in that process and works with them to identify what their goals are and what their use cases are, and then builds out a solution with them using our applications. Jenny Boston on the left bottom is our Director of Customer Service and Support. Jenny works with customers on the back end. So customers who have actually spent some time working with their data, working with the Cloudingo application and the Cloudingo platform. And oftentimes Jenny's challenges with customers are a little bit more technical than what Beth has to face, because they've gotten through that sort of baseline setup and now they really get into the nitty-gritty. So again, both of these individuals have direct contact with customers and understand their needs and their use cases. So Beth, Jenny, it's great to see you. Welcome to the session. We're glad to have you.
Thank you.
All right. So let's just jump right in. So we're going to actually start at the top level with the idea of duplication. And that's not the only thing we're going to talk about, but that's because that question came in the most. And when we think about data quality, that's the easiest one to wrap our heads around. So Jenny, Beth, when we think about cleaning up data that's in a Salesforce instance, or really any instance, it doesn't have to be Salesforce, but any data set, what are some of the key issues when we think about identifying and removing and even preventing duplicates? I mean, how do they happen? What do you do? How do you first jump in to that challenge?
So I think one of the first things to think about is the sources of the data coming in. We have different reliability, right? Whether it's people just visiting your website and maybe they only provide an email and ask a question and come in, so you have very limited data. And then if it's someone one of your reps has been working with, maybe especially by the time they're a contact, you have more information and it's probably more reliable because they've worked with them. And then of course we have all sorts of sources like list uploads and people going to trade shows and webinar attendees and invitees, and depending on the source, some of the things to think about in advance are, one, how reliable is the information? Is this a list you purchased that you know the source of information is very high quality? Or maybe people are just filling in bits of information to get some information from you on the front end or to investigate your product. And so depending on both the source, because that adds to the reliability, as well as what you can expect from the customer. For instance, you might ask your own employees to add more information than you would from a web form. For instance, I know, speaking from ourselves, years ago we required a phone number and people really didn't want to provide a phone number. So we got a lot of junk information, and we see that with other customers as well. And it's much easier to deal with an empty field than with all sorts of fields that are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or just provide a placeholder like none or unknown, that you at least know to expect that that's not a real value and you can override it. So I would say from the top level, knowing your source and how valuable the information or accurate it is really helpful to determine, do you want to augment your records or just use them as is?
So Jenny, do you have anything to add to that, or how would, so we talk about different sources, but how do you manage those various sources? Beth talked about some standardization within the sources, but when we think about the ultimate goal is getting those into Salesforce, what happens to managing those on an individual basis? How would you address that?
Well, I mean, if you're using a standardized tool that can check the data before it comes into Salesforce, like an import tool, or if you're using API calls to send data into Salesforce, having something in place to check those records as they're coming in, to determine whether there is a match already in Salesforce. And then after you know your data source, if the incoming data is more valuable, having the ability to customize it in a way that you can either override the existing data with the better data coming in, or if you know that the data coming in is not as valuable as the existing data, you can maybe opt to not override that data and just prevent it from coming in. So finding a tool or something that can assist you with that process is key. And also, just duplicate blocking rules, preventing in the preventative measure, just setting up Salesforce has a native duplicate blocking tool. There are pros and cons to that because, obviously you can configure the rules to block manual inserts and incoming records, but then you also block, data cleansing processes in the process as well sometimes. So not that it's a bad thing to be alerted if you're making updates or inserts, with your imports that, the duplicate blocking rules catch a problem. But it's just something that you have to be aware of, know what rules you have enforced, and know what to look for when those blocking rules happen.
So it sounds, again, one of the things you're kind of suggesting and arguing is that it's that level of awareness, and that having a plan is probably one of the first best things to managing your data.
Yes.
So give me a little bit more about if you have a data quality solution, or you need one, how do you implement one? I mean, I know, Beth, you are often on the front lines. You're getting people started. What are some of the first things that you need to do with the people that you first start out when they come to you and say, you know what, my data's a mess. I don't know what to do. Help me out. What's step number 1, 2, and 3?
So the first steps are to think about what the company's requirements are, because believe it or not, everyone handles their information differently. So for instance, a customer who would say, well, we could have the same person working with different hotels or different hospitals. So it's okay to have the same person multiple times if they're at different locations. Same thing for companies. How do we want to, if you're looking at the account level, would we say we just want one international, or would we say we want one per country and that's okay? Or would we say we want each location and it's important for us to enrich the data and to, as we can, get location level? So think about how you're using the data, and then what's important to establish a unique record for your own company, and then to start based on those rules and then your goals of where you want to end up. Then we build a plan for cleaning up the data from a high level, starting at a very, very tight filters that match your requirements, and then opening them up over time.
So, Jenny, I'm going to toss this over to you. If I'm a user and I know I need to clean my data, and we're speaking sort of on the highest level about duplicates right here, what are the features that I should be looking for in a solution? So we've got the Salesforce native feature, but you said there's some pros and cons there. So what do we need to be able to do to best clean that data?
Yeah, I mean, duplicates are inevitably going to make it into your org, no matter what. So having a solution in place is critical. And so you want to look for a tool that can be flexible in the way that you find those duplicates. So not just email match, but maybe, a way to customize crossing field matching. So if you had 2 email fields and you want to build a cross-matching filter, or to compare the 2 different emails, or just, having the ability to limit the records to a specific subset, like, specific record types only, those type of things. So the tool needs to be flexible in how you find the duplicates. And in order to automate, it also needs to have the ability to define how you want to choose a master and the field selections, so that you're not having to manually go in and pick and choose the master and field selections with every single merge. Once you predefine the list, setting that up initially is going to save you many, many hours of time down the road. The goal would be to find a tool that just loads the duplicates for you and gets them prepared for merge exactly the way your business wants them to merge every single time.
And to Jenny's point, another, I think, important idea about setting up master selections and field level rules, even if you're not going to automate, that really helps build in the highest quality. Because if you know, as a company, we want to, for instance, pick the highest status of the lead to be the master, then you don't have to worry about, did I forget to look at that this time? You know that certain fields are being handled. Hopefully you can automate it, but even if not, you have really key fields set up in advance to be handled properly.
So let me ask, how important is it to do this? Like, can I just, I found some duplicates. I just want to delete some and leave one. Can't I just do that?
Well, if you do that, you're at the risk of losing data. And so, when you're merging the data, you're picking and choosing values from all records, so that you have the most complete record during the merge. So yes, you could certainly do that, but you're not ensuring that you've got all of the data, not just field data, but related data. So if there are opportunities attached or cases attached, once you delete that record, it's gone, and so is everything that was tied to it. So merging, the duplicates is ultimately the best way to ensure that you maintain all of your data intact.
Totally agree, because there is a lot of activity and things like that you would lose if you just deleted. And the other side of the coin, if you have just junk records where there's not enough information to determine who the person is, or we've all seen made up names and made up numbers and emails that don't. A data solution tool that gives you the ability to delete if at the bottom line you have very junk information that's not relevant and not related to anything else. That's a nice function of most of the data quality tools, where you can build really tight filters with high criteria on when you would want to delete. But totally agree with Jenny. First choice is to merge if you have other records that they match.
So I'll ask one more quick question about deduplicating before we sort of move on to the next sort of main category. But why would I want some utility to help me do this? Like, I know in Salesforce on the lead, I can just click find duplicates and it shows me some, and I can select them and merge them. That's kind of built in. Is that not good enough?
Well, it's wonderful for occasional one-offs, or if you want your reps to, if they find something, merge, or but there are other tools that give you more advanced ways instead of just using the native Salesforce. And also a tool like ours would allow you to merge more than 3 at a time. So if you have a group of 25 duplicates and they're truly duplicates, maybe there's been a problem with an upload or a syncing issue, you can get them all merged instead of doing groups at 3 at a time. And also really customized so that you're looking for duplicates in different ways with different combinations of fields, versus saying something that's a little more fuzzy or possibly too tight, where you're using a strict set of criteria. Other solutions allow you to customize how you're looking for the duplicates, and sometimes find things you wouldn't otherwise find.
Jenny, anything you wanted to add to that about why a solution will be necessary?
Well, I think it's, given the one-off situation, you're just lucky if you find a duplicate that way. You just happen to stumble across it. But with a solution, a tool that can actually query Salesforce and find those for you, you already have the list. You already know what the duplicates are, and you don't have to go search for them. So, yeah, but that kind of goes along with what Beth was saying too. So.
All right, so let's move on just a little bit. And again, talking about, oh, I'm sorry, Beth, did you have something else?
No, I was just thinking, great point.
So let's move on just a little bit and think more, again, getting a little more granular about data quality and about consistency in data. So what does consistency in data mean? And how do you establish and maintain consistency in data? So what are strategies that you see in the people you work with respect to what are their needs with respect to consistency, and how do you address those needs? That can go to both of you.
All sorts of things, transforming options where you say, if we always want to use the state name or the state code, you can have tools that no matter how it comes in would help format it properly. To would it be helpful to have addresses in a consistent format where you can use a tool that updates the US Postal Service deliverable standards, so that then if you go match by the address, your matching styles are less important, then you can rely on other fields as well. To mass updates and mass deletes, if you want to make sure that your contacts have information from the account that's consistent, or maybe you need to use information on the accounts to make contact decisions, you can write fields and build that in from the account. Jenny, anything to add?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. There's just keeping the data between the objects and the fields that are shared across the objects consistent is pretty important. One way to do that outside of a tool is to use validation rules in Salesforce. Again, there's always going to be pros and cons of setting up a lot of rules in place in Salesforce, because it may block other processes like deduping if you use a third-party tool. But again, it's not really a bad thing as long as you have a way to bypass it, from the deduping perspective. But setting up validation rules to enforce certain logics, such as making sure your start and end dates kind of align. You're not putting a date that begins earlier than one that ends, or later than one ends, that kind of thing, just to enforce your users' data entry to be valid and in line with what your organization requires. And thinking about some of our other customers that are not always nonprofit, but some of them that deal with household accounts, just making sure that when you're merging your contacts and with some of the products out there, the nonprofit starter pack, it will leave anonymous households out there. So just to make sure that you're keeping data consistent, having a tool in place to kind of merge both records at the same time, so that you avoid having those orphaned records out there to begin with.
Jenny, tell us a little bit more about that specific data model, because I don't know how many people in the audience actually have been, it's not always just the nonprofit success pack, but it's other,
Right.
often B2C kind of data sets. They may not be familiar with how that household object works and how it auto-generates, and then what happens if you only merge the contact portion
Right.
of the relationship.
So,
can you unpack that a little bit for us?
yeah, that's a great point. So for anyone that is using what the household model structure is basically, instead of using a business account, it's structured more to use household names. So, if you have a contact named John Smith, the household may be John Smith household, which would technically be the account. And so what happens is, when you merge the two duplicate John Smiths, if one of the households is left empty, the package will automatically rename that household to something anonymous. So it just kind of goes off into its own little black hole, if you will. And it makes it really hard to find the duplicates afterward, because a lot of times those households don't have, additional information like street or phone number or anything that is relevant in order to help you find those matches. So just having a solution in place that would automatically merge the household when the contact merge, because that doesn't happen natively in Salesforce. But there are tools like Cloudingo available that can do that. Well, I don't know if there are other tools, but I know Cloudingo can do it.
And just to add to the importance, but when it could be named anonymous just because there are no more contacts left, but a lot of times customers don't realize what information is tied to the account instead of directly to the contact. So that's why it's additionally important to make sure that's merged as opposed to just left out there where you might be losing related objects.
What are your thoughts about using some of the other Salesforce native strategies to maintain consistency in data? So Jenny, you talked about validation rules, but what about required fields or pick lists or any of those other strategies? Do you recommend them? Do you find them problematic?
Well, again, anything, it can be problematic if you're trying to, perform mass updates to certain records and you have a lot of rule enforcements. But from the front end, when your users are using Salesforce daily and they're putting stuff in, yes, having field requirements, restricted pick lists, for example, if you have a cancellation field, one of the status is canceled or disqualified, and you require that your reps put in a reason for that disqualification, making that a field requirement when qualified is chosen is one way you could kind of make sure that your data is not just consistent, but accurate. They're putting in the data that's required. And, yeah, so for sure, requirements on fields would definitely help.
Another tip around that, one of the things that we see when we're helping customers clean up their data is to have a tool that will let you group fields together that need to be handled. So as you say, if you require a reason for a status change or a loss or something, you need to have a tool that allows you to group those two fields so that when you're choosing the status, you're also pulling in the reason that goes with that status. And that can be important with anything from addresses to original source and source details to newest source and newest source details, or reasons for validation and pick lists. So that's another tip that people often don't think of up front, but as you really get into the data, it becomes important.
So let me give you a specific use case, because I actually had a conversation just yesterday with somebody about this specific use case. And I think it is really illustrative of the importance of standardizing and consistency in data. And the challenge the customer had was that they had done a big import into Salesforce, directly into Salesforce. I mean, everybody does that all the time. That's how we get a lot of data into our Salesforce instances. And on the phone field in Salesforce, there's a built-in validation, typically for the North American phone structure, where the area code's in parentheses, and then there's a space, and then the actual 7-digit specific number has a hyphen between it. But what this individual didn't realize was when they did the imports, the numbers were all in a single string. And Salesforce allowed the phone field to be populated with that single string where all the numbers were compacted together. And so tell me a little bit about why that potentially could be challenging when you're thinking about data quality and maybe even specifically deduplication, number one. And then number two, how would you, what corrective action would you put in place to reformat that data set?
Well, several tools have update and formatting and standardization. I know Cloudingo is one of them, where if we are looking for the North American structure and it just gets entered as a string, you can choose to format however you would like. Would you like to go back and put it in parentheses and a hyphen, or compacted, or a space between? So you have a number of options for reformatting the data so it's in that consistent structure. And that can also be used on other fields as well. For instance, if you're going to send out mailings from Salesforce, usually people are using another system. You may want to format title case for first name, last name, and company. Things like that. That can be done just as an update, whether or not you're doing merging or deleting. You can just go in and format the data. Is that the type of thing you were thinking?
Yes, actually. Yeah, Jenny, anything more to add?
No, I think just also, even if you don't have a tool in place with the state and country formatting, if you wanted to standardize that, Salesforce has its own state and country pick list, which you could also, it's a pretty tedious process when you first set it up the first time. But once it's set up, it's really just mapping the countries, and then your list is already there and pre-built, and it's available for all users. So, just wanted to bring that up in case people weren't aware that Salesforce offered that.
Well, and I think the underlying point here to all of this is the more consistent you can make your data, the better it's going to be and the easier it's going to be to actually manage it in various ways, whether that's deduplication or just reporting and all the different ways that you have to query data. If it's consistent, then you get better results to any of those processes. All right, so let's move on. So one of the next big categories that came in from as we were polling the people who are registered for the webinar was inaccurate data and how you deal with it and why it matters. So of course, everybody wants to know that their data is accurate. So how do we know when it's inaccurate? How do we manage it when it's inaccurate? What are some of the tips and tricks that you might do when you're working with your customers to find that data and then to correct it in some way?
Well, Steve, one of them ties in with the example you just gave, and I see it all the times helping customers to learn to upload lists, is the really importance of grooming your spreadsheet before importing. So that could be anything from pick list fields that you want to make sure your values are actual pick list values, to if you have required fields. Sometimes we get ready to import a list and a customer realizes there's information that they need that wasn't there. So taking a little time in advance to standardize, to groom. If you have email fields that are not in an email format, do you want to look that up in advance, or is that something you can do without, but you don't want to import bad data? So just taking a little time on the front end to groom your data before you bring it in really helps both with, believe it or not, speed in dealing with the data in the long term and getting it in, as well as preventing inaccuracy as you go.
Jenny, what would you add to just the idea of inaccurate data and how you handle it or how you find it? How do you know?
Well, I think it goes back to the very first topic we covered, which is just making sure you're managing your duplicates, because duplicate records are going to have different data in most cases, and just having a plan in place to know which data you want to retain from the records, and having a way to customize that and standardize that is critical. And then, from a Salesforce perspective, integrating your data with third-party vendors as well, or third-party systems, setting up integrations to keep two platforms in sync, that kind of thing.
So tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that, because I know that we have lots of customers and other vendors do too, where they've got a marketing automation system, or they've got a billing system, or they've got some sort of ERP, and the data is flowing back and forth, which also means that there are various kinds of access points where data can potentially get messy, it can get inaccurate. Again, it comes back to those sources. So what do you do about that?
I think it just goes back to the first point. You just have to know the sources and have a plan with what you're going to do with that data. If you know that the ERP system data is 100% golden, then you're going to want to default that record as your master, and maybe just fill in blank values from the non-master records, for example. and just, that's just from a merging perspective, but, there are other integration processes that can also check, for duplicates before the data comes in. I don't know if that's what you're leading up to.
Yeah, so you mean within the various solutions that you're aware of, you can manage this process, that
Right.
the solution kind of sits in between the
Right.
flow of data and manages the quality and the data and consistency as it's moving back and forth.
Yes.
Okay. So what happens if you make a mistake? You bring in some bad data, or you have run a process to clean data, but actually you made an error and you chose the bad data or the inaccurate data to override what you had identified as the good data. What's the corrective action in that?
Go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, well, obviously Salesforce has a recycle bin, so you could go try to restore the deleted records from the recycle bin, but that's only going to restore the shell of the record. It's going to give you the field values that were on that record back. But if, let's say you were merging accounts and you had 100 contacts tied to that account, when you merge the accounts, the contacts are moved over to the master account. When you restore in the Salesforce recycle bin, it doesn't bring those relationships back into place. And so the 100 contacts that just moved over to the master account are still left on the master account. So you're either going to need to have an internal backup process happening daily, so that if a catastrophe happens or a problem happens, that you have a backup, and you can download those files and re-import them to reassociate the relationships for all objects. And you would have to know your table structures, your data structure, because it's not just contacts. There's cases, there's opportunities, there's all kinds of other objects related to accounts that you would need to consider when you go to do your restoration process. Or you could just find a tool that has an undo option available, which basically the tool would just be taking a backup of the data before merging, so that you're not having to do the internal backups. I would still recommend doing internal backups regardless, because there's never any harm in doing backups and having your data just in case something really bad happens. But having a tool that can do an undo process on a merge would be really nice.
Do you recommend using the Salesforce export process as a backup?
You could, but there are other vendors out there. Like if your admin is not, yeah, you could definitely, if your admin's got a way to do that, great. But there are other third-party tools that can do it, full backups too. But typically you don't always have to have one. You can just make sure your admin has a internal backup plan in place so that daily or nightly backups are being taken.
Okay, good. So let's move on then. I know everybody on this panel has worked with Salesforce for a long time. We've all been various data stewards in various ways, and most of our attendees are working with Salesforce and they're data stewards as well. So we know when we're mucking around in Salesforce, a lot of times we're not actually using the data, but we're actually working with the data. So we work on the Salesforce side of things, and that's in support of other business operations who actually need to use the data. They need to report on it. They need to make outbound calls, marketing efforts, all those different things, right? So when I'm clicking around, occasionally I see a problem and I might just correct it. I'll adjust the formatting on a record or correct the spelling, or if I see a duplicate when I've done a search, I'll quickly merge them. But that's not exactly a scalable process. I'm sure nobody on this webinar wants to go through their entire data set and look up every single record and see if there's a match somewhere and compare those 2 or 3 or 10 or 100 records to each other and pick the various best parts of it to make one clean record. So how do we scale? Like we, as a data steward, as a human being, we can't scale in that way, but how do we automate this?
So one of the tips to automating, and we'll talk about when you would automate and how to set that up, but also one of the tips that I share with customers is it's like cleaning your kitchen. The more frequently you do it to maintain it, the much smaller the job and the less time it's going to take. So if you have a process that you only do once a month, the jobs are going to be bigger, there's going to be more time involved, and it's going to be a much bigger project than if you
As
have
a person who cleans his kitchen every night before bed, I appreciate that metaphor.
Thank you. And as one who knows sometimes on the weekend after not cleaning it up during the weekend, it's crazy. But the idea of having a product where for your high confidence, and we'll marry this back with the last question, you certainly don't want to automate things where you have a high probability of needing to restore or undo. But when you have tested filters and duplicate checks where you've got a very high confidence that these are truly duplicates, we've tested the merge process, you can schedule those to run on a routine basis, for instance, nightly. It takes very little energy from the Salesforce end or from your product end, and eliminates all of the human interaction with having to go into things that really can be automated, because we say these would always be duplicates if these fields match, and this is how we want to handle it. And then when you get to the wider filters, where they're not necessarily high confidence duplicates, and you do need somebody to take a look at them, at least there's smaller groups of records that you need to review, because everything that can be handled on a routine basis is being handled on a routine basis. And it goes back to just those rules about being able to reliably set a master and field rules. And one last thing to tie in with the last segment, if you have a solution that allows you to back up all the fields you might need, for instance, if somebody comes back after you've merged accounts a couple months down the road and says, wait a minute, I thought this account was owned by Aaron and now it's owned by Reed, or any of those things where I thought this was a customer, but it says it's a prospect. Any type of questions, if you can think of the fields that are extremely important to you, even if the records are basically accurately merged, but you just want to go verify something for someone who has a question of the account. If you've captured on some sort of an audit report in advance, it takes very little time to set that up on the front end and say, these are the fields that we'd like to be able to go back and review, versus on the back end, having people question their data quality or how something was handled, or have that nagging feeling that something might be missing when in fact maybe it wasn't. Frequently we look things up with customers who someone on their team thinks it's been merged and find out either it was not the record they thought, or that it was handled correctly because they have put these rules in place. But if there is a case where you need a piece of information, you have a way to go look it up if you've thought that through.
So you're advocating kind of a predefined historical record, like having a predefined historical record. Okay, great. Jenny, anything to add to that? Just about how do we get the individual human who's responsible for managing the entire Salesforce instance for a whole organization out of that mix, so that they can actually continue to maintain and have a high quality of data?
Well, as Beth already talked about, the deduping process, just setting the automated jobs to run to handle the merges and converts, and then on the lower level confidence, that do require a set of eyes, you can still automate that. You can just set, only look at the records that have been modified, like within the last week or whatever, and then set a reminder for yourself to only, to check that filter again every week. And there is usually going to be a way to filter out by modified date so that you can clearly only see the records that are maybe a potential duplicate from the week before when you checked last. And from a non-dedupe perspective, you can also try to find a tool that will allow you to filter out unwanted records, like maybe have invalid emails or with no address, no phone number, no relevant data. Or that, that's just one of thousands of examples. It could be on any object. It doesn't have to be just a standard object, but maybe you have log files and a log table that you want to delete after a week. Find a tool that can mass delete based on criteria that you specify, either in a Salesforce report or building the criteria, and just set those jobs to run automatically. And updates, with you can keep jobs running consistently to keep your data consistent. For example, address validation. If you are checking your address, to see if the address is deliverable, and maybe you're standardizing those addresses, those jobs can be automated as well. So just thinking outside of the dedupe perspective, just finding a way to manage just your regular data consistency and accuracy, ways that you're updating your data, is also almost just as important.
What do you both, because I know when I'm working with people, I see this both at the beginning and throughout their history. How do you address old data, and what recommendations do you make to customers who have historical data that's been in their database for years, even decades, and it's a part of their data set, which means it also becomes a part of whatever operational procedures they have with reporting and activity and things like that. Do you make any recommendations or suggestions for that kind of data?
Well, ultimately, it's going to be up to the customer and how long they want to retain the data. But Salesforce does have an archiving feature that they can, they could request to archive some of the data or migrate that data to a separate org, for example. I don't know if Beth has anything else to add to that, but.
I would say to consider how long it's actionable. If it's an account that you have in there and there are no contacts tied to it, but at some point in time, like your example of 10 years ago, somebody added it when they were trying to grow the business and nothing has been done and it has no activity, no contacts, or even no activity within the last year. If it's not valuable, rather than growing a pile of data that's not useful for you, think about if it has strategic or actionable business purposes. And if not, you may consider developing a set of requirements that say, we want to delete this information after a certain point, and of course the criteria would be different, whether it's leads, contacts, or counts. But if you have leads that are not actionable, sales reps can't call them and they're not serving a purpose for you. It's just kind of ground clutter as you're trying to do your other operations.
Great, thank you. So I want to jump in because we're getting a little bit close to the top of the hour to some of the specific questions we've had. They've been coming in through chat and things like this. The first one I'm going to throw out there, we've kind of touched on, but I want to revisit it only because I have some additional thoughts about it. And that's specifically about standardizing formatting. The question came specifically for phone numbers and addresses, but also what could be done for text. So let me throw that out to both of you, and then I'm gonna make a suggestion on an alternative method that can also be done. So again, standardizing various data sets that go into specific kinds of fields.
Did you say you want me to answer this one?
Either one of you, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, as we discussed earlier, the transform, can be used for phone formatting and text formatting to kind of keep things standardized, making sure that you've got the parentheses and a dash if that's the formatting requirement that your organization wants. And then using the address validation tools to standardize your address, or finding abbreviated street names and replacing it with a spelled out street name, those type of things. So yeah, I think it's important for some, especially for some customers that use those for automated internal processes.
So the one tip I wanted to throw out there, if you don't have resources for an automated solution or a third-party solution like Cloudingo or any of the other vendors who are on the market, is that if you know what you're doing with your data and you know how to use Excel pretty well, you can take exports of pieces of data as long as you make sure that that bit of data is tied to the record ID in your export. And then with Excel formulas, you can reformat phone numbers, or you can take text and make it into title case or all caps if that's something you like, or those sorts of things. There's various things that you can do to manipulate the text outside of Salesforce and then run an update. It can be a little bit cumbersome. It works great. It can also be a little time consuming, but the most important thing about using a strategy like that is that you just be very careful in your Excel file to make sure that you don't get your lines out of order. But it certainly can be done. So I wanted to give a tip to if you don't have resources or are unable to access an external solution to help you with your data. All right. Another question, what happens about false positives? So this is obviously somebody who's worked with filters, the idea of finding matches for various purposes, and in the context of the Cloudingo platform, that would primarily be around dedupe, but there's other things. So how do you manage false positives?
Well, I mean, first, you just want to try to tighten up your filters, the criteria that you're using to find the duplicates. So if you're finding false positives, there, maybe you're just searching too narrowly. Maybe, if you're just looking at first and last name, for example, well, there could be thousands of John Smiths and they have nothing to do with each other. So, adding an email match or a phone match or street match, something that is definitive to that unique person or account or whatever, that makes it a match. So that would be, one thing, the first thing you would try to do. And you're not going to always be able to tighten the filters up. So finding a way to hide or protect those records from the filter results is an option. So I know in Cloudingo, we have the feature to hide or protect, which basically just eliminates that particular record. Say you're skipping over a group repeatedly because they're not duplicates. If there's not a way to filter them out, then, and you never want to merge a specific record, then you could hide or protect it from Cloudingo. And then it will stop. If you hide it, it will stop showing up in the filter results entirely.
So that kind of feature ability would be something you would recommend looking for in whatever solution it is, whether that's Cloudingo.
Yeah. And there are some, things to consider when you do that too, because if a true duplicate comes in a month later and you've hidden the record from Cloudingo and you don't want the new record that just came in, it's not going to find that match either. So there's pros and cons to that. It's really kind of more for one-off scenarios, one-off companies or people that you would never want touched during a merge. But when you're working with the looser filters where you are getting false positives, I mentioned earlier that you can set a last review date. Well, basically it's the last modified date in the filter, so that you're only seeing, it would require a one-time initial cleanup, merge everything you can, skip over what you can't merge. And then once you get through that initial cleanup, you set a last modified date or review date, whatever day you actually did that review. And then you are only seeing new potential matches coming forward. So you're not having to go back and re-examine all those duplicates that you've already looked at and are not duplicates. So that is a way to automate the process. It's still going to require manual work but it will definitely cut down the time that it takes to do that process.
So I'm going to ask one last question before we kind of wrap things up, and that's questions that have come in a couple times around reporting. And these questions were specific around our platform, Cloudingo, but let's broaden that out. If you think about reporting, what would you look for in terms of reporting, whether that's pre-merge reporting or post-merge reporting? What would you look for or recommend that clients look for in a solution? Either one of you.
So I think there's a difference, and think through what the purpose of your reporting is. Post-merge reporting, I touched on that earlier, where you want to think about the fields and the IDs that would be important to capture in case you want to either say how many records have been merged or refer back to them in some fashion. Just make sure you get that set up before you actually do the merge process. For the pre-merge process, think about the same thing. What detail do you want before you actually merge? And is it for the purpose of sending out to let people verify that, yes, these are the records that we're going to merge, or to make some decisions on? And make sure that the tool you use will specifically capture all the fields that you want and be customizable by object, because obviously you need different information for different objects.
Yeah, and for the attendee who specifically asked that question with regard to Cloudingo, these various sets of reports are available within Cloudingo. There's a full suite of reports, both pre and post merge. All right, well, we're just before the top of the hour, and I know where I'm at, it's lunchtime. So it's going to be a time for me to get some nourishment. I want to thank you, Beth and Jenny, for participating in this panel and being a part of this series. You know, I have huge respect for both of you and so glad to call you my colleagues, and it's so nice to see you since we don't all sit in the same office any longer. I also want to thank the attendees who signed on to the webinar. I hope that you found this valuable and useful. If you have any feedback, we would love to hear that from you. The questions that we didn't get to, we will follow up with via probably emails or some other means. We'll handle that in some way on our side. We'll also send a copy of this recording out. If anyone is interested or has additional questions about Cloudingo or about our team, or even just general questions about data quality, we are happy to talk to you and answer those questions. Feel free to reach out to us at contact@cloudingo.com. You can also get a wealth of information at our website, cloudingo.com. And should you be interested, we would love for you to start a trial of Cloudingo. It's a free, no obligation trial. And the benefit of that trial is it actually gives you a full analysis of your data set and a health check on how things look in your Salesforce instance. So that can be found at cloudingo.com too. It's literally less than a 5-minute process.